The latest from our daily newsletter at podnews.net. The number of podcasts in Spanish grew 6.8 times last year, according to iVoox. 55% of Spanish podcast listeners are listening more now than before the pandemic, according to a new study. We've linked to it in full from our show notes and our newsletter today. Spanish listeners will also have another big show to enjoy. Canción Exploder will be a Spanish-language version of Song Exploder. It's to launch in early 2022 on Radiotopia from PRX, produced by Adonde Media. Podcast publisher Audi thinks there's more to podcasting than just America. Andrew Cressati, CEO and co-founder of Audi, is a guest on Podland this week.
Our global focus is very much the world excluding the United States. We think that the cliched rest of the world is in fact an incredibly exciting market.
You'll find Podland in your favourite podcast app. The Chinese podcast platform Ximalaya has cancelled plans for a US stock exchange listing and now plans to file for an IPO in Hong Kong after apparent pressure from the Chinese government. It has a market share of 75% of all audio consumption on mobile platforms in the country. SXM Media is unveiling new programmatic capabilities for podcast advertising at the IAB Podcast Upfronts, producing a single access point for all SXM Media's inventory. Alternative music network Adobe has signed an exclusive agreement with AdsWiz for global monetization of its audio inventory. It's an expanded agreement between the two companies. Transistor has given any customer access to their private podcast feature. The company is beta testing dynamic pre-rolls too, and says it has 16,200 podcasts using their service. According to Listen Notes, 11,500 are in Apple Podcasts. And how accessible is your podcast? The Talking in Common podcast is also signed in Auslan on its website. Auslan is the sign language of the Australian deaf community. And in podcast news, CNN's The Handoff returns for a second season today with Don Lemon and Chris Cuomo. The show was an exclusive on Apple Podcasts' paid subscriptions for season 1, but this season it's freely available everywhere. Podcast.co's Meet the Podcasters is back for a new season, this time in video too. The podcast explores the craft of podcasting with hosts of successful shows. From Audio Always, the British MP Jess Phillips has launched a podcast called Yours Sincerely, which asks guests to celebrate 3 people that mean the world to them. The Lineup is a new podcast from British music broadcaster Sean Keaveney, discussing favourite festival memories with special guests. Unpleasant Dreams is new from Jim Harold Media. It's a weekly 10 to 15 minute researched podcast focusing on strange cases of the supernatural and true crime. After 2 weeks from launch, it's already achieved 131 ratings. It's hosted by Cassandra Harold. And you'll find more podcasts today, including podcasts about 9/11 in our show notes and our newsletter. Coming up, another minute of Pod Zen. Just to note that our Patreon corporate supporter rates will increase on Monday for new supporters only to reflect our growth. And I mention that none of these podcasts are paid for inclusions, just in case you thought they were. And that's the latest from our newsletter. For all the links, we're at podnews.net.
For Pod News, I'm Evo Terra with your Minute of Pod Zen. If you haven't yet heard the phrase, podcasting is an intimate medium, well, then you must be new. But can this reported intimacy ever be anything more than an empty promise made by podcasting advertising advocates? Is intimacy overhyped in podcasting? Probably. Advertisers don't buy podcasts because podcasts are intimate. They buy podcasts because podcasts perform and provide results. Making a more intimate experience hasn't really impacted average ad CPMs, which feel rather stagnant at between $20 to $30 for the last decade or so? And can we really measure intimacy in podcasting? Spoiler, we can't. Consumption rates are neat, but only if you assume few people play podcasts in the background while they study, work, or sleep. But we don't have a good way to prove that. Our current standards body, the IAB, cares about measuring audience reach, not intimacy. And then there are the myriad bad actors who would almost certainly use intimacy measurement protocols in nefarious ways. What would you do if you could measure intimacy? Would you use those metrics to change how you produced your podcast? Or would you just compare your show's intimacy metrics to average intimacy metrics across all other podcasts, much the same way we benchmark our download numbers or CPM rates? You'll find more thoughts on this topic and other questions every working podcaster should be asking themselves at podcastpontifications.com. I'm Evo Terra. This has been your Minute of Pod Zen.